Wow. You know, I've never talked about this topic to people with wine glasses in their hands. Maybe it'll make it a little easier. I really want to note that I tried to dissuade Ken from picking this particular topic as he rattled off a lot of the things that I keep busy with. There are a lot of other things we could talk about. But he said, no, this one's pretty important. That said, it's a pretty serious topic. So every once in a while, you know, you've got to keep your sense of humor. So I may make some really lousy jokes. And also just keep in mind the words of that famous regional philosopher of yours, Jimmy Buffett. If we weren't all crazy, we would go insane. So, you know, my intent tonight is not to scare you. Okay, that's the first thing. But I don't know that I will send you home with sweet dreams either. What I really hope to do is spend a little time educating you on this topic, because there's a lot of you know, superficial knowledge about it, and it's a tough one to get your arms around and think about in a rational and systematic way, instead of one that just can fire up your emotions. My own perspective on the problem was really crystallized one night at dinner shortly after 9/11, where there were about 5 of us from the U.S. with one colleague from France. And we were obsessed that night at dinner, of course, with what are we going to do about this new terrorist threat that's been thrust upon us. And she listened to us for a while, and she finally said, excuse me, she said, I just want to say something. The trouble with you Americans is that you always want to solve a problem. We French have learned that many problems can only be managed. And that was a pearl of wisdom that really struck home when I started thinking about this particular area, which I had already been working on for the better part of the previous 10 years. And it's only deepened my perspective as I've tried to articulate in broader audiences about what we should do about it. As with most serious and controversial topics, the answer always lies between the extremes of what we should do. And so let's have a little tutorial first off on what we're talking about when we talk about weapons of mass destruction. I went to that very reliable source, Wikipedia, to get a working definition, but it actually was a pretty good one. A weapon of mass destruction is a weapon, that's important to remember, a weapon that can kill and bring significant harm to a large number of humans or other life forms, and or cause great damage to man-made structures like buildings, or natural structures like mountains, or the biosphere in general. Credit is given to the Archbishop of Canterbury for the first recorded use of the term weapons of mass destruction after the aerial bombing, which included chemical weapons, of Guernica in 1937 during the Spanish Civil War. He said, "Who can think at this present time without a sickening of the heart of the appalling slaughter, the suffering, the manifold misery brought by war to Spain and to China? Who can think without horror of what another widespread war would mean, waged as it would be with all the new weapons of mass destruction?" And that was 8 years before the first atomic bombs were used. The first and only atomic bombs were used. The post-9/11 environment actually was fueled by the anthrax attacks and the Iraqi suspected programs of WMD brought the topic to the front page to all of us. And in fact, another wiki factoid that I found actually amusing in this context was the following. Because of its prolific use during this period, the American Dialect Society voted weapons of mass destruction and its abbreviation WMD, as the word of the year in 2002. This was followed in 2003 by Lake Superior State University, which added WMD to its list of terms banished for, quote, misuse, overuse, and general uselessness. Well, we may try to get rid of the word, but unfortunately the problem is still with us, and the problem will be with us for some time to come. The most cogent statement that I think I got from my wiki research was the following. The scope and application of the term has evolved and been disputed, often more politically than technically. And that's where things get really messy. Because while we can think, as I do as a techie, of the various technical or operational things we can do to help address this problem, there is an overlay, a heavy overlay of politics in this particular area that confounds at times the best things that might be done. And I'm not going to get into a political statement about things, but I do have a couple of statements to make, and then we'll leave it. What I've observed in political circles is because of their short terms in office or that kind of thing, and they want to do something, they're seriously committed to doing something about the problem, they latch on to a favorite, okay? And by that I mean a favorite. The bio threat is the most serious threat we face, or the nuclear threat is the most serious threat we face. And then within that, they also latch on to a specific action to take, and then we put a lot of money behind that, and we go do that one thing. And a good example of that was what happened right after 9/11, when Dick Cheney, said, "Oh my God, what if it had been a nuclear weapon instead of an airplane into the World Trade Center?" And that's an important thing to think about. And he set in motion the establishment of an office to worry about the nuclear threat, specifically at the newly formed Department of Homeland Security. But then Congress got in the act and said, well, we know the solution. We'll screen every container that comes into our ports for radiation. So every container now goes through a radiation portal monitor. And a lot of money has been put into making sure that commerce is not unduly interrupted in that, because speed is important to keep the commercial sector going. So we've spent several billions of dollars putting in radiation detectors at ports. Now, I think any one of us can think of other ways that if we were serious about getting a weapon into the country, there are other ways to do it. And so we're still very vulnerable, but tight budgets, we spend a lot of money, we're not going to spend a lot more money for the time being. So it's troubling to me working in this area that again we latch on to these point solutions and don't do what our my wise French colleague said, which is manage the problem. And by manage the problem, what most of us tend to focus on is what we would call a defense in depth strategy. This is not a new idea. It's been around for a long time. But what I mean by that is on this next chart. No. There we go. That starts with thinking about, what does it take from the beginning of an adversary first thinking about acquiring a capability all the way through to, heaven forbid, a successful attack, and then what would we do about it? And so it sort of falls into, to four headlines, if you will, where the ideal first step, of course, is to figure out that they're thinking about it and starting to acquire some capability, and we stop it, okay? And that's where things that, you know, are going on now with respect to Iran sort of fall in that bucket. Now they've got it. Now they're intent on attacking and all. Well, then forces should be brought to bear to try to intercept it and neutralize it. That's a much harder problem because now the geography has started to interfere with this, because what route are they going to take? How many more, you know, how much larger of an area do we have to monitor? If indeed we're unsuccessful and they are successful at mounting an attack, then we should be doing everything we can to reduce the consequences. And in spite of what you think about these weapons, there's a lot that can be done to reduce or mitigate the consequences of an attack. And finally, we don't want it to happen again. So we better be able to quickly figure out who did it and take action against them. If I go behind each of these, then here start to appear some of the favorites that you hear various leaders talk about and investing in. If I want to prevent acquisition, this is where, you know, we spent a lot of time through the Cold War writing treaties with all the countries around the world to not proliferate. And in fact, to do a lot of work monitoring the protection of special nuclear materials that would otherwise be used for nuclear energy, legitimate uses, but not for weapons. And that's but one example. We've signed the Chemical Weapons Convention. We have not signed the Biological Weapons Convention because of difficulties in verifying it, but we abide by it. Other things that we can do unilaterally that we can get into, and all, but really working security issues as well. If we want to stop it en route, then we really have to have the tools to be able to follow it, and once we get it, get our hands on it, then we have to be able to neutralize it and the like. While it's not an issue of interdiction in Syria right now, it is an issue of what are we going to do to, you know, if the state fails, and how are we going to secure those weapons and neutralize what amounts to vast stores of chemical weapons in Syria. If things happen, we need to, as we said, mitigate and recover. A lot we can do around preparedness. I remember as a kid, it didn't mean a lot, but I sure remember those drills in elementary school of duck and cover, and we've sort of forgotten the lessons of civil defense. There is an impression around a lot of people who are not well educated around nuclear weapons, for example, that the game's over. Everything's, you know, it's the end of the world. Not so. Okay, that's not to say it won't ruin your day, but it doesn't mean that everything in the path of, you know, a device is going to be vaporized. But a lot with respect, and I'm going to get into each of those, the nuclear, chemical, and biological pieces in a minute to talk about specifics. And finally, the prevent, what we call prevent reload, we've got to be able to attribute it correctly and respond. And not unlike what we did post 9/11, I won't talk about Iraq, but Afghanistan, and all, but that requires a pretty good forensics capability, because it's going to be hard to figure out with a lot of these weapons who did it. We may figure out where it came from, but that may not necessarily be who did it. And then what are we going to do? I got to tell you that this is one of the hardest things for political leadership to deal with, as it's been addressed in a number of, if you will, war games around, oh my God, they just used a nuclear weapon or a biological weapon on us. a weapon. It didn't destroy the country. It isn't the old mutually assured destruction scenario. What are we going to do? And so it's not just we're going to nuke them back, right? First off, they may be a very small group of people, and they may be hard to find because they may be dispersed. So this is not a trivial question, and we have yet to grapple with it. Okay, so given that as background, we've got sort of a framework to think about the problem, but the devil's in the details. That probably won't surprise you, in that you got to pay attention to what's the difference between a nuclear weapon, a biological weapon, and a chemical weapon, because they don't play out in the same way. Okay, with respect to let's take them in turn. With respect to the nuclear weapon, you got to get your hands on some pretty exotic materials. Okay, even though uranium is a fairly accessible metal that can be mined, it doesn't come in a form that's useful for weapons. In fact, only a significantly small fraction of the isotopes of uranium are useful for a nuclear weapon. Plutonium, you've got to do further processing on, and so to do that, to get your hands on the materials themselves, is a pretty you better have some resources, and you better be at it for a while. So that the real point is that there's signatures associated with that. So I have some ways to early on detect that someone may be trying to acquire a capability. Now, I'm setting aside for a minute the fact that they steal one or that they're given the materials, but even given the materials, there are ways to handle that scenario too, because you can follow the transactions and who's talking to whom, because only a manageable number of actors in the world currently own the materials. So that's sort of, the basis of what has been for a very long time our approach to the nuclear weapons piece. The other piece is the opposite end of the spectrum, namely that a nuclear weapon deserves a nuclear weapon in return. So deterrence has been a strong part of the strategy. But now it's confounded in this WMD space where, like I said, they're only using one. And so what do we do with one back? And so we've got to think that through and work the problem. What we did in one of our studies is produce what we call some contour maps, where I took that list of those second-order missions around the defense strategy and wrote them along that bottom axis. So you don't need to read them. It just goes all the way from diplomacy to retribution, i.e., well, I better not say kick the S out of them, but that's sort of what I had in mind. And sort of, again, I'm not going to say there was great quantitative analysis behind this, but a lot of us debated, what were the relative values of each of those approaches in the defense to dealing with a nuclear weapon, and it's heavily weighted toward the front end. You got signatures, take advantage of that. You've got more options early on to keep someone from acquiring the actual weapon, so focus a lot of your resources there, balanced against the deterrence equation on the right-hand side. Now, if I want to go to think about biological weapons now, it's almost the opposite, okay? In that bio is going to be very, very difficult to detect because it's so easy to do it side by side with very legitimate activities. Legitimate activities in a pharmaceutical company, legitimate activities in a research laboratory, and the like. But if there's any good news in the bio story, the effects are not immediate like they are in a nuclear weapons scenario. That it takes a while to get sick. Okay, and so if I can properly diagnose that someone who comes in and presents flu-like symptoms has not been infected with the flu but something else, then I have a way of starting now to look locally, and then maybe a little bit broader than that, at others who may be displaying the same symptoms, and now I can intervene medically. Okay, now that's easier said than done because it requires a public health system that is very agile and very responsive. And what came to light as we thought more and more about this problem is that we have underinvested in our public health surveillance systems for some time. So that first part, the big if I can detect and diagnose quickly, is a big if. But at least it gives me a pathway forward for how to address this threat and certainly mitigate the consequences. So if I plot some of the same kinds of considerations for the bio threat, it looks a little bit different. I start to want to look at the mitigate and recover piece, and I still want to figure out who did it. But it's going to be very hard, much harder on the front end, to try to pull out that someone is doing illicit activities as opposed to things that are perfectly fine. We have invested over the last 10 years, post-anthrax attacks, in a lot on the medical side. Part of it is what's called the National Stockpile of vaccines that HHS has been working on. I will say they haven't moved with great speed, but they seem to at last finally have their act together. And the problem, of course, is in developing new medical countermeasures against these kind of threats, you can't do human trials, right? So you've got to come up with other ways to get approvals for how you're going to distribute, use these drugs on a mass casualty basis. And that has confounded people for some time. I can report positively that there actually seems to be some movement in FDA around that particular issue over the last year. So I have much more optimism about our ability to start to put therapeutics on the shelf, so to speak, to deal with this problem. Finally, let's talk about the chemical threat. It's almost the forgotten stepchild in this, this triumvirate of nuclear, bio, and chem. The last decade, I guess, fueled by Cheney on the nuclear side, the anthrax attacks on the bio side. We sort of said, well, chem's just not that important. It takes too much to have a mass effect for starters. That's sort of the conventional wisdom, but now you start to play out scenarios and how quickly we forgot the lesson that Aum Shinrikyo should have taught us in Japan, that had that attack been executed as planned, it would have impacted a lot more than the few dozens of people who were killed and the couple thousand who were exposed. It would have impacted literally tens of thousands of people, because the subway is a great way to rapidly disperse the agent. So the good news is that we've put, understanding that, we did put a lot of sensors in a number of metropolitan subway systems that are the so-called detect to warn kind of sensors. So if there is a release at one station and it's detected, the train system's shut down. So the trains are not the propeller, if you will, the wind tunnel, creating the wind tunnel that would propel the agent throughout the system. So at least you confine the impact of the attacks to a relatively small part of the system. But other things, and other things have occurred in a positive sense as well, and that's related to concerns about an intentional bhopal, for example, that someone would intentionally blow up a chemical plant, of which there are lots along here, and at a time when the winds were blowing favorably, right, to impact a highly populated area. And so a lot has been done to upgrade security in chemical plants over the last decade as well. But there are lots of issues with chemical that we're starting to see, and I will only say, and I can't say much more about it, but we only recently discovered how extensive the Soviet program was, and one of the defectors has published a book about their research, and that has introduced a whole new class of weapons that we don't have any way to deal with yet. We're just starting to study that problem. So I think that you know, the lesson is, if you know, for me, is that it's almost like putting your fingers in the dike. You can't stop, and when you stop, you know, when we got to enlist more fingers, and so and we've got to stay the course. I want to summarize, because the tutorial part of this was just to give you enough background to now prompt a number of questions, because I could take this in all kinds of directions, and I don't know where you guys want to do it, so we'll open it up to questions. But I do want to summarize my own comments with a few things. It's not the hare. I mean, it's not the tortoise, but the hare that's gonna. I got that screwed up. It's not the hare, it's going to be the tortoise that wins this game, right? And it is a game, and it's going to be a game that's with us for a very long time. So we need to expect to play the game with some persistence and some balance as we go forward. Also, this notion of defense in depth should be in front of everybody. It is not something that should be politicized, as opposed to something that we need to stay the course. I would also argue that, having presented you some of these scenarios around the Homeland problem, when you get into the warfighting situation, some of the priorities shift. When you get into the failed state situation like Syria, some of the priorities shift. So it's pretty hard not to take each of these, if you will, modalities of WMD and ignore any one aspect of a defense in depth strategy. But at times I get discouraged, because we all know that as a nation we have a pretty short attention span. And so staying the course has always proved, on these types of problems, has proved to be a difficult situation, and it will only get more so in tight budget times. And let me close by just asking you all the question to think about. If it's becoming, as it seems to be, easier for other nations, subnational actors, to acquire these types of weapons, why haven't we seen them used more often? And I don't know how to answer that. I can say that I think part of the answer is that there still seems to be a generally accepted bright red line. You cross it and you're a pariah, and the international community will rally that way. But I don't know how long that will remain a good operating principle. What we do see is that, in part, our own conventional military superiority has prompted moves in this direction by a number of at least state actors. So we have a bit of a conundrum, right, in trying to pull ourselves out of being a part of this, this future. We may be aiding and abetting others to go that direction. Let me stop and open it up for questions. Oh my gosh. Okay, this hand went up first.
Hi, thank you very much for a very interesting and informative presentation. And I'd like to ask you in the area of Iraq. One, did you think they had WMDs? What kind? And where do you think they ended up if they did have them?
Oh. I didn't want to talk politics. No, I understand. Well, let's see. I was pretty sure we had taken care of all of their nuclear facilities in the first Gulf War. That had been that we'd taken care of their nuclear facilities. Okay. The issue of the chemical weapons was the one that was confounding, and I believe that he figured out early on that this was not a good move on his part, and he got rid of them. Now, did he send them to Syria? Because all of a sudden Syria has the largest chemical stockpile in the world. Did he burn them up? Probably a little of both, but that's my my uneducated opinion. Okay, the stuff I can't talk about won't help you much in this one as well.
Thank you.
Okay, this next question.
Thank you for one of the best talks that I've heard here at the Institute.
Thank you.
It's timely and it's good. I'm Joe Edmiston. I'm an environmental consultant taught at the University of West Florida, and I'm acutely aware of radiation, and I did studies in the mountains of Puerto Rico for the effects of atomic radiation. So I'm not so much concerned about detecting alpha, beta, or gamma radiation. That's easily detected. I'm deeply concerned about biological warfare and anthrax. What other disease other than anthrax is being carefully considered? I've seen studies that show anthrax the spores can last for 100 years. What other biological things are on the horizon? Thank you.
Well, let's see. Again, you hate to label things. Maybe it's bad news or worse news. Okay. Anthrax is not contagious, but it is very stable. So, from that perspective, it's not a bad weapon. Although you do have to disperse it, and you do have to breathe it, and that's the big issue with biological weapons in general. Is making sure that you actually get exposed, and that has proved to be, by those who have tried it, proved to be very difficult. We ourselves spent a lot of money trying to perfect the art of dispersion, and we had mixed results. That was before we abandoned biological weapons in the early 70s. There are, let's see, there are things I can't talk about a lot that are on the threat list that are infectious. And that's a little more frightening, because now, in the age of suicide bombers, I can have a suicide-infected vector in a person and put them on an airplane and let them sneeze a little bit, and now I've infected the plane, and everybody gets off the plane, they're not sick yet, and it spreads. if you want an idea of what the Soviet Union worked on, there is another defector, a guy named Ken Alabek, who defected in the 90s and talked about a range of weapon agents that they worked on and the like. But for me to acknowledge that, I can't do it with my clearances. Okay. Sorry. What we have invested a lot in the research community is what we call not broad spectrum, but broader spectrum antibiotics and vaccines that would help cover a range of agents, so that genetic mutations of agents, which is the big bugaboo that you would, be able to engineer these agents to work around these, would not be a threat. I won't say that we've met with great success yet, but that's certainly one of the main directions in the R&D community these days, and all. Okay, we had a question here, and then questions over there.
Thank you very much for coming this evening. As you look around the world, which nation or group do you think poses the greatest threat to us today?
But don't get into politics.
Yeah. I worry about them all. That's a cop-out answer, but let's see. No, I don't worry about them all. I do not worry about Russia. Okay. I don't worry a lot about Russia, and I don't worry too much about China from a WMD perspective. I worry about China for other reasons, but I don't. And all. So some of the bigger nation states that have too much to lose are not going to go there. I don't believe. I think the North Korean recent missile launch, provided a huge wake-up call in Washington, because nobody was thinking they'd get there that fast. And all. And by the way, that seems to characterize the way we do a lot of things, is that we sort of say, well, they can't do it. I mean, they may be able to do it eventually, but not in my lifetime, or not on my watch, and that kind of thing. And we get surprised a lot. So that was a big surprise. I know that was for a fact. And so things that I worry about in that context are that they are indeed successful. It prompts South Korea and they've already threatened to acquire their own capabilities. The Japanese will follow. The Chinese will up the ante. And we now have the cascade, right? The Indians get more paranoid with China, and the Pacs get more paranoid with India, and the Iranians I can work my way all the way through the Middle East and say, this is really scary. None of it directly involving us per se, except North Korea, unless North Korea chooses to threaten Japan, because they can't really get to us. So you start thinking about these cascade effects, which we never had to think about during the Cold War, and we don't quite know what to do about it. And it's not that a lot of people aren't thinking about it, it's just that it's hard. It's hard to figure out how do you deal with it. So.
Considering Iran, is it even feasible to use a military option against their nuclear weapons? And if not, then what are the ramifications of living with a nuclear Iran in terms of their exporting their expertise to some of these terrorist groups and setting off devices in Israel and triggering a wider thing and things of that nature?
Let's see. I guess we're going to get political now.
Hard to know.
Hard to not. Well, I mean, particularly around the nuclear question. I have a lot of I don't knows in my answer, but if Iran gets the bomb, I don't think the Israelis are going to put up with it for very long, and to hell with us. Okay, whatever we think, and we are struggling with options on what to do about it. We can let ourselves get drawn into that, or we can let it play itself out. Now, what I honestly, maybe it's the optimist in me. I think if things get bad enough, that regime in Iran is going to be have a limited life. Okay. And I also think that there will be other ways than going nuclear to take out their nuclear capability, as has already been demonstrated by Stuxnet and the damage that caused. That sooner or later they're gonna give up. But it's going to take some political heroics that accept them more on their own terms, because that's fundamentally what they want. It's not about attacking the U.S. It's about, I believe it's about respecting their place in the world, and we haven't done much to help that along yet. But like I say, we may never get that opportunity, because I think the Israelis are going to be pretty strident up to that point. The question for us is then, what then? And all. So let's see, we had some questions over here first. Right there.
9/11. We had 19 people that wanted to dedicate themselves to taking down the Twin Towers. You can't speak of that politically. They were jihadists. And it's probably going to happen again on all three fronts that you've elaborated on. How would you respond to that?
Let's see, how would I respond to it is one thing. How the nation should respond to it is really difficult, because now they've crossed the red line, right? But they is not a nation state. On the other hand, the nation state that harbored them, okay, now this is going to be Mem speaking, should pay a price. Okay, that hosting a group that was able to mount a WMD attack seems like some sort of target for us. Now, I don't say go nuke them, because that's unfair to all the innocent people that were there. But it sure depends on the connections and the connectivity that was there. Now, you guys go out of here and quote me on all of this, but this is a very, very serious red line to cross. What honestly I worry about the most is that we won't be able to figure out who did it. Anybody that's going to go to that length, one, is going to have some resources to pull it off, and two, is probably going to do a much better job than this gang did at covering their tracks, and all. If they don't, they're sort of, they do have a death wish, but I just don't know a better answer than that. That's why I shy away from some of the policy issues and try to work on the technical aspects of it, because some things are pretty hard. Let's see, we had some questions over here.
I have a slightly different question. I'm interested in, with the emergence of cybersecurity, and cyber attacks, how cyber is factoring into the new thinking outside the box for weapons of mass destruction and their implementation.
And there is a lot of debate about cyber being the fourth modality, and the like. And we're just starting to come to grips with how serious or not a capable cyber attacker attack would be. I think the thinking at this point is that it will be much more of a serious infrastructure problem and could shut us down for some time, particularly if they go after the power grid and the SCADA systems and that kind of thing, where some equipment that's relatively irreplaceable for months could be easily taken out, potentially. It's speculated that that could happen. A lot's being done to protect it now that wasn't before. And that would impact a number of people who might be in intensive care facilities or special care facilities that depend on power. But whether it creates a mass casualty effect is something we don't fully know. And I haven't seen any work, although it's not a domain I spend a lot of time in. I haven't seen any work that suggests that we would end up with a lot of lives lost. But we sure could see the overturning of the government if we're sort of cybered into the dark ages for a while, and the like. How we deal with it is going to be very, very interesting. So. And then there's another question back over there and here.
Most of the terms in front of us relate to what the government would do, except for domestic preparedness. I know in the Cold War we used duck and cover drills and dog tags on children and bomb shelters. How does domestic preparedness look today, and who exactly is responsible for implementing it?
The Department of Homeland Security at the top of the pyramid, you know, and if in turn the extent of, I mean, there are a lot of authorities and a very tortuous path that would bring the DoD into action, so that if the extent of damage were significant and it overwhelmed law enforcement assets, then you would bring in the Department of Defense, you know, the National Guard, then DoD to help support the response and the consequence management aspects of the problem. And that's another area that post 9/11 nobody had ever thought we needed to exercise, and now a lot of attention's been turned that direction, so that you now see exercises that bring all those entities together, because it's not easy to figure out who's in charge of what, you know, when things get critical. And all with respect to sort of the pre-event roles and responsibilities, you've got players even like EPA that are going to set the cleanup standards, you know, in case you have to clean up after any one of these attacks. So there's a role to play, although they won't be directly responsible for the cleanup. So it's a fairly complicated discussion. I would have said 7 or 8 years ago, oh my God, let's hope nothing happens for a while till we get our act together. And I won't say that it's perfect, but a lot's been done to really move us forward, at least in an operational sense, if not having all the equipment that everybody would like to have in an operational sense to be able to respond to a domestic event. What has surprised me, however, is that there hasn't been a strong civil defense aspect to this, because we seem to have forgotten, you know, some very simple lessons from the 50s that would do a lot to help everybody take care of themselves before the cavalry comes in, right? So.
Time for 2 more concise questions.
Okay. Well, let's see. Let's move around the room a little bit. We've got a question back here, and we got a question back here. I apologize.
Yeah, Doctor, thanks for coming today. I worked at Defense Threat Reduction Agency recently in WMD counterproliferation, and one of the areas we worked on was radiological sources and that type of thing, and preventing proliferation of that material. How would you characterize the threat of the radiological sources, dirty bomb type attacks, versus your 3 main categories that you discussed earlier?
Let's see. You know, this is another one that's been debated a lot, but the conventional wisdom is that okay, what he's talking about is if somebody gets a hold of a cesium source out of a hospital and then blows it up and contaminates large areas, and all. And the analysis that has been done on that, and it's really very good analysis, points to 2 things. One is that the exposures for most easily obtained radioactive materials like that, if you spread it over a wide area, are not going to be so serious as to cause a lot of casualties. It will, however, create a huge cleanup problem. So the economic impact would be significant. The other thing is that we sort of know where all of these materials are. So securing those and or replacing them with less attractive radiological dirty bomb sources is something that's within the doable time frame. Now, a lot of debate about doing that is going back and forth, but it's something that on the scale of the way the feds spend money, it's a couple $100 million, so it's not that much money. So that's a problem we can seriously take off the table by and large. Question in the back. Oh, right here. Okay, I'm sorry, right here. All right, and he's had his hands up.
You're walking the wrong way.
Wrong way. Wrong. There we go. There we go. Okay.
Hello? One of the threats that's been talked about and Congress has investigated crystallized with an event in the Caspian Sea in 2008. That was the test of a Scud missile off of a freighter by the Iranians. If the Iranians were to get 2 or 3 bombs, which might be likely in the space of the next few years, why wouldn't they consider using an EMP attack on the United States? That's the first part of the question. And the second part of the question is, there's legislation that's been kicking around the Congress for the past couple of years called the SHIELD Act. And the utilities in the United States are opposing it. The SHIELD Act would force them, and ironically at no cost, to shield this country's electrical grid.
Okay, on the first first count, the first nuclear weapon you build is probably not going to be an EMP weapon. That's a fairly sophisticated design, and the like. So, of course, they could build an EMP weapon eventually, but I suspect that more than suspect. That the first devices they build, if they want to be a nuclear power, will not be EMP weapons. Otherwise, they're going to be in the R&D business for some time to come, and I don't think that's what their goals are. That's not to say that somebody else might not do it or might not want to do it, but there's a fair degree of awareness of what of the need to do something about it, so that that indeed it's been debated in Congress and it's been worked by a major commission about what we need to do about it and the like. I haven't kept up with why the utilities are opposing it, but I don't think it's just zero cost because of what I understand of the way some of the systems operate, at least, that it will require some investment. It's not a break-the-bank investment. Now, will PUCs allow that? I don't know. You know, this is where things get sticky, right? Where the feds edict something and the like. I will say that one of the things I do in some of my spare time is chair a standing task force that is looking at EMP and other nuclear weapons effects and survivability of military assets. And that extends beyond just the warfighting assets to what infrastructure do they depend on. So we shine an indirect light on these issues and all, but DOD lacking the ability to force the infrastructure of the country to do anything. The strategy is, what's your backup plan? What if you don't have it available? What are you going to do? So that's not a very satisfactory answer, and I will explore a little bit more about this SHIELD Act because I didn't realize that the utilities were opposing it. Okay. All right, one last question.
Thank you. At the point of prevention, you're dependent upon intelligence. And last night, I listened to a C-SPAN presentation of a Mark Thiessen interview of General Michael Hayden, former director of NSA and the CIA, Jose Rodriguez, who was in clandestine services, and John Rizzo, who was their department consul somewhere. And the point that retired General Hayden made was that when the situation having to do with enhanced interrogations was considered by President Obama, and language was drafted to require that we depend only upon the rules in the Army Field Manual, which originally was just the first prong of a two-prong approach for interrogation, where they had a secondary prong they could fall back on, and they no longer have that as a leverage. The very threat of the fear on the part of the person being interrogated that they might be subjected to enhanced interrogation. We've lost, apparently, according to them, all three of them seem to agree that leverage that could be brought to bear on a subject is no longer there. And what I think General Hayden very tactfully suggested might have been done when the language was drafted was that if the president had inserted just the last part of the sentence that said, you know, depend upon the Army Field Manual, unless further measures are approved by the president, it would have left that hanging as a little possible cloud and given some more weight for. So I'm not going to ask you if intelligence has diminished, because that's a national security matter. What I will ask you, however, is there at this point a possibility for reintroducing that concept to the president for consideration?
I'm not going to touch that one. I'm sorry. But,
I'll be waterboarding you later.
Yeah, right. Look at intelligence about this. I will say, though, intelligence about this topic has got to come long before we have rounded up the suspects. We have to find out that people are starting, crazy as it sounds, people are starting to think about this. That's how we have to think about this problem. And right now, what I can say is that with respect to WMD, the way we go about it is in a tiered system because we don't have all the assets we'd like to have to devote to it. So what are the most imminent threats? And that's in Tier 1. And I can't tell you who's in Tier 1, but that's in Tier 1. Tier 2 gets a little bit of attention with the leftovers, and anything else gets almost no attention. And it's the anything else where we don't have evidence, that we're not looking, that we're going to be surprised. Okay? So we've got to come up with a whole different paradigm for how we think about, collecting intelligence in this future world where anybody and everybody, if they had intent, could get it with enough resources.
On that cheerful note, let's thank our speaker.